Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to hear Dr. Kusano's talk as well. So let me share my screen. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about a kind of different approach to network analysis, and I will address directed acyclic graphs briefly, but we're really going to focus on mental health, and there's some reasons why using a different graphical approach can be helpful, but still in the realm of Bayesian statistics. So no conflicts of interest to report. Just to give an overview of the talk, I'm going to start with network theory in clinical psychology and how it's been used recently. And it's a relatively kind of new contribution to the field, and talk about Gaussian graphical models, which is really how the field has network analysis, and give an overview of two of the kind of psychological components that are most relevant to the talk today, depression and mindfulness. And then I'll talk a little bit about Bayesian Gaussian graphical modeling and a specific project that I've worked on with some collaborators and the methods and results, and pull everything together. So what is a network theory of mental health? It really started recently, within the past few decades, thinking about how do we conceptualize mental health disorders. Historically, we think about something like depression as having it or not having it. So as a dichotomous yes or no. And so network theory reconceptualized or worked on conceptualizing mental health concerns as connections between symptoms. And so the symptoms can be represented as nodes, and the connections between nodes represent the causal factors in the disorder. So what is leading to depression? It's an interrelation of symptoms of depression, not you have depression or you don't have depression. And so this really sparked strong interest in how can we quantitatively assess these kinds of connections. And there have been a few researchers that have really worked on. Dr. Epskamp is one researcher who's developed the statistical methodology to apply these models to data in the field. And what it is, it's a network of partial correlations. And because these networks can be quite big, there are many ways to correct for multiple comparisons or tune or regularize the networks. So you're trying to eliminate some of the spurious correlations. The original conceptualization and the original models were really cross-sectional, so really only taking a single time point, and they're not directed. And this is a big kind of difference to traditional Bayesian networks. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But there's also some statistical assumptions about the data being continuous and assumed to be normally distributed. And there are ways to address violations of that. But broadly speaking, it sort of has pretty stringent requirements on the kind of data that are appropriate. And again, this is one of the reasons why Bayesian approaches are helpful. So what does this kind of emergent field look like in clinical psychology? It's really been used to elucidate interconnections between symptoms within and across mental health concerns, right? So we can have depression, which we're not thinking of so much as a unitary construct, but really we're starting to think about it a little more in terms of what are the symptoms that are related. And classically, we take depression as a sum score. We say, here's someone's score on a depression inventory, and if they score above this threshold, they have depression. If they score below this threshold, they don't. Or an interviewer will basically do a structured clinical interview and decide whether or not they have depression. And that typically corresponds to some scores, but the precision isn't perfect. And so there's been some concerns about the use of some scores. And the biggest concern and kind of the reason for this and the push for this approach in clinical psychology has been to do with how effective are the treatments. And if we conceptualize mental health concerns as being composed of interrelated symptoms, so it's not depression, yes or no. Someone has depression because they have a certain number of symptoms, and someone else has depression because they have different symptoms. That might mean different things, and might mean that the treatment that is the most appropriate and the most helpful for them looks different. And so there's been some really great research thinking about how, if we actually don't look at the sum score, but we look at how the scores, how like individual symptoms might present in depression, how much heterogeneity, how many differences can we come up with? And there's been some really nice work looking at exactly this question, showing that there are a lot of different ways someone can have depression. It's not just this kind of single yes or no. And so I list out some of the most common symptoms of depression. I'm not going to read them off, but one of the reasons why I'm talking about depression right now is because it's an extremely prevalent mental health concern in the US, but also globally. We're talking hundreds of millions of people globally. When we start talking about how to use networks for informing clinical decision-making, one of the approaches that's been taken up as a particular way to isolate targets in treatment is thinking about centrality. So what if we take a group of symptoms and we look at individual associations, and again, paring them down, regularizing them, so we try to eliminate some of the more spurious correlations. What can we find out? And so centrality has emerged as one particularly relevant way to think about which symptoms might be the most important if we're thinking about symptoms within a particular mental health concern. And so in this paper, the authors showed that energy is central. And what that means is just really interconnected. There's a lot of associations between energy and other symptoms of depression. And in this paper, they also look at other factors that might be related to canonical depression symptoms. And so again, the graphical appearance of energy in the center is not exactly what centrality means, but it just reflects the interconnectedness, the number of lines that you see connected to the energy node or the symptom node. And there's a way to quantify this in terms of you're just measuring the total sum of the correlations to that node. And so you can see energy losses the strongest, but there are others that are quite strong. Okay. So another important thing when thinking about mental health is interrelations between psychological constructs. So along with the kind of consideration of a diagnosis as a yes or no, there's also consideration of comorbidity, having more than one mental health concern. And it's more common to experience more than one concern for a lot of folks. It depends on the specific clinical concern, but it makes understanding kind of those interconnections between something like symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety especially important, because if we know there's a lot of folks that are experiencing symptoms of depression that are also experiencing anxiety, understanding where those interconnect allows us to understand what drives that comorbidity, right? Rather than thinking about it, oh, these things co-occur just in a broad sense. So there's been some really nice work on that. Okay. In addition to thinking about depression, people have also started to look at psychological constructs using network analysis, because again, if we think about these sum scores as representing maybe like overrepresenting diverse differences between people, we can start to miss out on some of the individual variance and how these constructs using self-report measures really present heterogeneity. So mindfulness is one construct, and I'll talk about the relationship with depression briefly or shortly, but there are two kind of ways of thinking about it. The most common way, if you hear someone talking about mindfulness, being mindful, has to do with like a height of state awareness, being engaged in the present moment. And that's like a state experience or representation of mindfulness. And there have also been ways to measure it as a trait. And so we can think about it using a particular measure, the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, these trait characteristics of mindfulness. There's some evidence that it's a stable trait, but also that it can change with, for example, a mindfulness-based intervention. But the 5 facets are observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judging, and non-reactivity. So people have started to look at how mindfulness relates to things like depression, and generally people have found these kind of negative correlations. Here's someone that took a sum score of depression and is looking at different facets of mindfulness and finds this nice, strong and negative correlation here. And just generally, it's pretty understood that if you're more mindful, you're likely to have lower symptoms of depression, like if you're scoring higher on this. Now, again, getting at causal connections becomes a little challenging. So it's more just an association, but worth kind of thinking about as a potential mechanism. And the reason is because there are a number of mindfulness-based treatments for depression that are quite effective. There's very good evidence for them. Just 2 of them are mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and another one is mindfulness-based stress reduction. This comes from quite a lot of research. But the tricky thing, and this is true again of all mental health treatments, is the efficacy is only on average. We know that some individuals don't benefit. And so an important aim for data-driven research, and one of the ways that using network analysis is useful, is to figure out potential targets. So we can think about starting to personalize interventions, increase efficacy for people that might not be benefiting otherwise. And so this gets to Bayesian Gaussian graphical models. It allows us to do some things that we can't quite do with traditional inferential statistics in the literature of Gaussian graphical model, and that has to do with getting uncertainty intervals around the estimates, and also hypothesis testing, which is the core of the paper that I'm going to be talking about. And then we can also compare the graphical models in ways that we can't do with traditional GGMs. So the aim of the paper that I'm going to be talking about was really to understand how mindfulness and depression interrelate on a facet or symptom level. So some folks have started to look at facets of mindfulness and just a sum score of depression, but I spent quite a bit of time talking about how heterogeneous depression is. And so really thinking about, are there specific symptoms of depression that might be more relevant to think through when you're considering a mindfulness-based intervention? And another kind of concern, and I think it's useful to think about, what are the measures being used in this type of research? And it's really self-report. Even if it's interviewer, we understand mental health, there are cool approaches being used to try to get at more biophysiological measures and things like that. But the standard is oftentimes just self-report. And so if we recognize that there's a lot of heterogeneity in what depression symptoms look like, we also have to think about, if we're using different measures of depression, does that affect how we understand interconnections within depression, and also when we're considering its relationship to other constructs like mindfulness? So just to review the measures that I'm using, so it's the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, the patient health questionnaire, which is a widely used measure of depression, and then the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, which is another widely used measure of depression, anxiety, and stress, and we're focused on the depression scale in this paper. So just an overview of the samples. So in the first 2 samples, what we did is we were looking at the facets of mindfulness and scores and depression symptoms, but we only looked at the PHQ in the first sample, and we only looked at the DAS depression scale in the second sample. And then in the third sample, what we did is we looked at all of them, or both of them together. I'm not going to go through the demographics, but the samples for this kind of analysis were reasonably sized. They can be bigger, but they're not too small. Okay, so there's a particular way of applying Bayesian Gaussian graphical models. And again, this is one of the advantages of this approach, is it allows us to first explore in those first 2 samples which associations exist, and also what are the most central facets or symptoms, and also which ones are the most interconnected. So which ones are bridging between mindfulness and depression. And then in a confirmatory analysis, which we pre-registered, we can then say, okay, we want to actually test how confident are we that these associations that we found in the exploratory networks are then confirmed in the confirmatory analysis. And again, in a Bayesian framework, we can actually think about, like, how strong is the evidence, not just do we meet the p-value threshold or the alpha cutoff, and is our p-value small enough, and things like that, which is one of the strengths of this approach. And so what we're really looking at in this project is bridging nodes. So what are associated within a specific measure, so whether it's mindfulness or depression, and across the 2 measures. And it's really just essentially a sum of the correlation coefficients that are bridging between the 2 communities or the 2 measures. So I did want to, specific to this conference, I did want to just address, like, why not use dark acyclic graphs? And they have been used actually specifically with mindfulness. I just think this is a great paper that looks at both traditional Gaussian graphical models and also uses directed acyclic graphs. The challenge here is really thinking, and it's not that I think they wouldn't be useful or they can't be useful, and I've played with using them before, but the challenge is that, especially with something like mindfulness, it's, do we really actually believe, is our prior, that there is a unidirectional kind of association, like that one facet of mindfulness really is predicting another facet of mindfulness, and not that they're interrelated. And from a theoretical perspective, I think it's a little bit tricky to parse out. And in this model, which I pulled from their paper, the direction is pretty weak. It's not much better than chance for most of these facets of mindfulness. And again, I think there's a lot of value in considering ways to apply these models in mental health research, especially when we start to think about incorporating measures that are not just self-report. So like physiology, genetics, we can get a lot further. But when we just think about self-report, reducing the possibility of bidirectional associations can limit how we interpret the data. And without kind of a really strong ground truth, I think it can be problematic. So again, I think this is a great example of a way to use dialectically cyclic graphs and like more traditional, in a more traditional Bayesian network approach. But in this context, I thought it was a little bit challenging to interpret and could lead to potentially some erroneous conclusions on my part. And so that's why I chose a different approach here. Okay, so what did we find? So here we're looking at what are the most central nodes related to facets of mindfulness and symptoms of depression. This is in the PHQ-8. And so we find two particularly strong associations between the facet of non-judging and the symptom of feelings of failure, and the facet of awareness and difficulty concentrating. And then we ran a second exploratory network, and we found, again, that non-judging was central, but we only found an association with feelings of worthlessness. And in the confirmatory networks, we were able to replicate and show that the relationships between we were able to both replicate the most central facets of mindfulness as being the most central in both networks, and also the specific associations. So it's a completely independent sample. And it's interesting because it also suggests that there are some differences in how facets of mindfulness might relate to symptoms of depression, depending on what measure of depression you're using. Because these two samples are completely different, and it's possible that something about the samples is really different in terms of how they're interpreting the facets of mindfulness or their experience with mindfulness, but the relationship in the facets of, with regards to the facets of mindfulness when we use the PHQ measure of depression is very different from how the facets of mindfulness interrelate. Because again, it's a partial correlation matrix, essentially. And so the relationship between the symptoms of depression also affects the relationships between the facets of mindfulness and vice versa. And yet, nonetheless, we are able to replicate both the centrality of non-judging and awareness and the specific associations. Again, it brings up this question of why do we find awareness as being central in one network but not another, and replicate that. And the main thing, and again, this gets at kind of one of the aims, which is to think about how different measures of depression might influence how we interpret or understand the relationship between depression and mindfulness, is that there isn't actually a symptom related to concentration in the DAS depression subscale. And so there isn't an opportunity to find that relationship, which both highlights the strength of looking at network analysis and also gets at some of the limitations of self-report that I was discussing earlier, where really the questions you're asking can very strongly influence, even on a symptom or node level, how you interpret the data or what you are able to find. So in terms of kind of the robustness of non-judging across all these samples and networks, it does seem to be like if someone is very judgmental and they're experiencing depression, that might be a relevant target for an intervention, but that kind of needs to be tested more explicitly. And then also thinking cautiously when interpreting these cross-sectional models, because of the fact that the specific measures you use will have a strong influence on how the network emerges. But the Bayesian GGMs provide a really nice way to develop and test hypotheses iteratively in a much more ideally replicable way, but it gives me a little bit more confidence about these findings. And I think that that's one of the strengths of just Bayesian approaches in general. All right, so thank you. Just wanted to highlight my collaborators, University of Texas at Austin and Palo Alto University, where I was doing these work, and the lab. And